Hello. So I'm Gemma Roberts, or Gemma Leigh Roberts in my working life. There's a bit of a distinction. So my background is I'm a chartered psychologist and I specialise in the area of uncertainty and resilience as well. So I'll be talking a bit about that today. My new book has just launched, Mindset Matters, which is very exciting. So I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that today. But really the things that I write about are anything to do with thriving in uncertainty, overcoming challenges or dealing with challenges. And I also carry out research in that area as well. So my doctorate research is also in the area of resilience.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Anna Vogt. I am based in London. I have been working in advertising now for, nearly 20 years, giving my age away there. Originally, I'm half German, half American, but I've been in the UK for about, 20 years now. So really feel at home here. And I think what really brought me into this space was setting up an agency and rebuilding it as, from a setback to a comeback, as the book suggests, that I've written with my co-author Sarah Tate. And what I love to draw on is sports analogies and psychology, because I used to be a competitive swimmer, and that's something that really has helped me in my professional life, my personal life, and just really looking at how we can reframe how we look at setbacks, how we can use tools to really turn them to our advantage. And then coming from marketing and advertising, how you can really make that your thing and make it actually something to be proud of and talk about and not try and hide away.
Thank you both so much for those introductions. I'm going to jump in with the first question, which is, how can we develop mental agility? So Anna, if you could start with this one, please.
Gosh, that's a big question. How can we develop it? Well, I think the first thing that we talk about a lot is almost like the perception, the image problem of challenges these days, right? And I think we grow up in a society where we really glamorize failures rather. You see lots of movies where big bombastic failures are elevated and celebrated, and they're very dramatic and all the rest of it. And we also love a success story. The thing in the middle, which is resilience or mental agility, however you want to call it, isn't particularly sexy, but that's where everything happens, right? That's where you learn how to work your way through difficult times, challenges, where you really develop that muscle memory to overcome whatever hasn't perhaps gone in your favor in life. And I think really looking at that slightly differently and not seeing it as something that's just a grind that you need to get through. And, if you don't get through it, you don't talk about it, but really celebrate it as a skill to learn, just like you would celebrate, being able to do maths or public speaking or whatever it might be. I think if we start to look at that slightly differently and value it more and really lean into it and try and actively teach it to our kids and, value it in colleagues and encourage it in those around us, I think that will start to get us to a place where we're much more open about having conversations around what it actually takes to bounce back and what the skills are that we can apply in that space. So I think there's a bit of an image problem. I think we need to sort of really rebrand that. I think we need to look at it as being something much more active that we practice a lot. And then I think obviously there are lots of tools that can be deployed to help bring that to the fore and to help us get better at it. Gemma, what do you think? You're the psychologist. I feel a bit self-conscious here because you've got all the data and all the statistics to back it up. I'm talking very much from a marketing perspective, so you can give substance to my prelude.
I think that's the beauty of the topic. That's also the beauty of us both being here, is that we get to talk about these things from different angles. But ultimately, I totally agree. I talk about failure so much in my work. And it's something that I know is scary. None of us start out our day thinking, oh, I really wish I failed today. I really can't wait to learn a lesson along the way. But ultimately, that is, to get to where we're going to go to, we have to go through multiple mistakes, multiple failures, if we look at them like that. But actually, a lot of the time, they're lessons of getting us to that next step. We learn what we're going to do again. We learn what we're not going to do again. We learn what works for us. We learn what doesn't work. So I think, I'm very much up for this rebranding failure. So count me in when in the rebranding failure world. And from my perspective, mental agility is partly about having a curious mindset. So when I did my undergraduate degree, I learned very quickly in psychology that there's no one perspective, that there's no one theory that tells us if you think like this or you do this, you're going to get this result. And actually that was a bit of a kind of like an earth-shattering moment for me. I thought I was going to learn the right way to do things. But ultimately it comes down to perspective. And I have one perspective, and there are maybe 10 other perspectives or 100 other ways of looking at that situation. So mental agility is about, firstly, being able to see other perspectives, other ways of doing things. And part of that's being curious and being very active in collecting information from different places or challenging your own perspective. But it's also broadening your perspective as well. So frequently challenging yourself. How else could you look at this? Is it a failure, or actually is this kind of a lesson I've got to learn? Or is this not great because I think this, but then the other person's getting something out of this situation? Maybe there's other ways of looking at this. So I kind of look at it like moving between ideas, having that curiosity, and also broadening out your perspective as well.
And I know that's something that you've covered on in your newsletter today. So for those of you on the call who don't know, Gemma has this fantastic newsletter that's also called Mindset Matters. And I think today's topic, if I remember correctly, was why failure can actually be a key part of your success as a professional and growing. So to kind of build on that as well, Gemma, I was going to ask if you could maybe talk about whether mental agility and resilience go hand in hand. Are they different? Do we need both of them? And what is the difference around them? Because I think the two terms are thrown around so much as buzzwords, and they've kind of become a little bit meaningless.
Yes. They are slightly different, but they're also part of the same thing. I mean, part of what there's so many things that make talking about resilience quite challenging. And one of them is that we actually don't have a set definition. So in the research world, we've kind of got some agreed upon things like it's positive adaptation following adversity, but that's not kind of set in stone. And different researchers will look at it in different ways. And the same with mental agility. So the way that we're looking, but certainly the way that I'm looking at my research, is that mental agility actually is probably part of resilience. Being able to, shift your perspective, look at things from different angles, gain information from different places. But actually, sometimes they overlap and sometimes they're different. So I think it's really important to kind of figure out what it means for you as an individual, even though, I've got half a foot in the academic world. I'm very practical at heart. So really it's about finding tools around these things that actually help you. So I probably didn't actually answer the question very well. Apologies for that. Hannah, what do you think?
I think, yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's so many different ways in which you can take it. And I know I've always found it quite interesting. We sort of found in the process of writing our book as well. And again, I just, thinking back to my time as an athlete, a lot of it comes back to that as well. I think it has a lot to do with our relationship with certain things, like how do we look at success, for example? How do we benchmark our success versus other people? There's a really interesting study by, I think it was Cambridge University, done a couple of years ago, and it was looking at how we are defining success today and how people experience success versus 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the thing that kind of came out of that was that actually we have a very outdated definition of success. And so a lot of people are feeling like they're failing or falling short or not progressing in life, not because they are, but because they're sort of made to feel that way by those around them or by these old benchmarks that exist. So, 40 years ago, the benchmark was, and it sort of still is, if we're honest, money and status. Actually, if you look at what millennials want, Gen Z, it's much more about happiness and fulfillment and flexibility and being able to contribute to society and being healthy and all these other things. But we don't value those as success metrics. So there are a lot of people feeling inadequate who really shouldn't be. It's just that the norms in which we live in are totally outdated, right? So that's one thing. Another thing is, I think the whole comparative process, right? So I'm not saying that we don't fail, because we do, but I think we always look at, oh, I've done this compared to this other person. Haven't they done well? Or they haven't failed as bad as I have, or, this went badly, but, somebody else actually did it quite well. And I think this constant comparison just gets us into massive tizzy as well. And again, I'll cite another sports study. There are many more to come, so buckle in. There was a really interesting study done amongst Olympic swimmers. And they looked at the difference between Olympic athletes that made finals and Olympic athletes that didn't make finals. And when you get to that stage in your athletic career, you kind of assume by and large that absolutely everybody trains in a very similar way. There's the same routine, there's the same kind of diet and all the rest of it. And by and large, 90% of people did exactly the same thing, same kind of training and all the rest of it. But the 10% that really was different was in those people that made the final and those who didn't. And that was around how they benchmarked themselves leading up to the Olympics, right? So the people who didn't make the final, by and large, would benchmark their progress based on how they would place in competitions, which is always relative to everybody else around them. So they go into a competition wanting to win it or wanting to come in third or second or whatever it might be first. But that was always then dependent on how those around them were performing. And the Olympians that made the finals were the people who never benchmarked themselves against their peers, but only ever against what they wanted to achieve. So it was usually against a time or a physical quality or whatever they needed to sort of push themselves on in any given swim meet. And I think that's really interesting because we often look around us for validation, to feel like we're a success or to reinforce the fact that we think we failed. Whereas actually, if we just stick our nose in our own lane and just sort of say, okay, what do I want to get out of today? What do I want to get out of this year? What do I want to get out of my performance review at work, whatever it might be? I think we'd see setbacks and successes very differently. So I think there's a lot of things we can take from that as well. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that was a great answer. And we love a practical kind of anecdote there as well. But actually what you've touched on around this reframing of resilience and even failure that you said earlier as well. And I know, Gemma, you've got some myths that surround the concept of resilience. So I think this is probably the best time to maybe just bust some of those.
Yeah, there are lots of myths around the concept of resilience. So one of them is that resilience is kind of pushing through, overcoming challenges, getting to the other side. And actually, sometimes that is what resilience is about. But actually, that's more like mental toughness or grit. So perseverance, passion, pushing yourself through. Now, when you face a challenge, and we're talking, resilience is so much wider than that. You might find that sometimes you do need to push through. You just need to get through a situation. I certainly have periods like that in my life. But actually, sometimes you don't need to do it. Sometimes you need to stop. Sometimes you need to build your energy reserves up again. Sometimes you need to rest. Sometimes you need to go and find some kind of support. Sometimes that it'll change depending on what's going on within you as a person, and also what's going on around you as well. So if you're dealing with tons of challenges at the same time, something really small could send you over the edge, whereas normally it wouldn't. Or if you've got one big challenge, like, I don't know, pandemic, for example, that can cause different reactions as well. So it's really important. So often when we think of resilience, we're thinking about that pushing through, getting through the challenge. But to be honest with you, that's part of the process. Sometimes it doesn't have to be. It's also okay to break down before building yourself back up again. It's okay to change course. It's okay to completely fail. It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay for things to not go to plan. All of those things and how you react to those things help to build your resilience. So that's kind of one of the, I guess, biggest myths. The other one that I talk about a lot as well is that we often talk about what's going on within us when it comes to resilience. And I talk about this a lot as well with individuals. So what can we do as individuals to build our reserves? And partly it's different for everyone. So partly it's knowing who you are and what works for you. So there's a lot of reflection involved in that. But partly it's kind of what's going on around you as well. And there's a whole body of research coming out about the context of resilience. So thinking about support is a huge one. It's probably one of the most underrated resilient strategies is having a really great support system around you. And I talk about it a little bit in the book as well, because there's lots of coaching exercises in the book. So one of them is this idea of building a support committee around you. And it's really important because it's not all about you. Sometimes it could be stuff going on around you. Are you in a situation that helps to boost your resilience? Think about, relationships or your working life. Do you have support around you? So that's another one of the things that I talk about, that yes, we've got to focus on what's in our control for sure, and how we've got to take accountability for that, how we can build ourselves up. But equally, it's about putting yourself where you can and where it's in your control in situations that also help you to nurture your resilience.
Thank you.
What do you think, Anna?
Yeah, completely agree with all that. And it's interesting, a lot of interviews that we conducted for our book were with people who had sort of hit that rock bottom, I suppose, and were then slowly building themselves up and trying to rediscover their mental agility and their resilience. And what was really interesting was some of the commonalities that people exhibited in those situations. And one was around the topic of flexibility or not being flexible, actually. And often it was the fact that people feel like they have to stick to their guns when they're doing stuff, that gets them into a situation where they just basically can't move forward anymore. And it's learning to embrace flexibility as a strength and not a weakness. Again, that's, I think, a massive misconception, that you got to stick to your guns, you got to power through. Gemma, you're just talking about that. But being able to sort of see flexibility and being able to shift your point of view and shift how you see a situation as a strength and not a weakness is something that I think they all had in common in different ways. Which was really, really interesting. And for some, it was about embracing, their sort of more vulnerable side and admitting the things that were tough for them to deal with and admitting that to those around them, or, mainly to themselves in first instance. And there are many other themes that came out of that. But I just thought it was really interesting. And you see it a lot in the sports world again today, right? You see, was it Simone Biles during the Olympics who stepped down because she was suffering from I think a lot of anxiety. And you see Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, who as well, famously sort of came out to say she was really struggling on court, and that was really difficult for her. And Powerade has just run a big campaign called, Pause is Power, really celebrating the point that sometimes you've just got to stop. You got to stop and you got to take count, and you've got to just say no to everything around you before you can reset, before you can progress. And there's so much power in that. I mean, there is so much good that can come of that. But again, there's a lot of stigma around stopping, right? It's like, oh, you're being lazy, or, oh, you've given up, or do you not know where you're going? And that just comes back to, I think, some of the norms we really need to challenge collectively as a society, because it's making life more difficult for everyone who's trying to rebuild. And actually, there's a lot of power in stopping and calming down and just sometimes even going backwards to go forwards again.
Yeah, of course. And I think you're completely right, especially around the stigma. I think both of those athletes have had various issues in their career based on the fact that they chose to speak out about how things were impacting them, which is so sad. But hopefully we can work towards reframing these. And you've both spoken about or touched upon kind of this idea of stress and uncertainty. We've all gone through a pandemic, everyone was very stressed. But it doesn't look like that is going to stop anytime soon. We are just now in this uncertainty and disruptive state. So I was going to ask if you've got any key tips on how to build mental agility and resilience, especially during times where maybe the walls are feeling like they're closing in a little bit. And Anna, I know you've spoken to, not just for the book, but for your podcast as well, the Rebuilders podcast, a lot of people about this, and you yourself with Sarah, your co-author, you've turned around these amazing, this massive agency as well during times of stress and uncertainty. So if you could maybe share some of your tips, that would be great.
Yeah, I think that the pause one that Gemma mentioned is a massive one for us, and we sort of talked about it more generally as pace, right? And how do you pace yourself to success? Sometimes absolutely you have to speed up, right? Sometimes there's a big opportunity and you just have to embrace it and you have to run towards it, because time is of the essence, because the adrenaline and the energy is a good thing for that situation, and you've just got to power through to that. So that's a great thing. Sometimes it's about really consciously slowing down and taking periodic breaks, whether that's throughout the day, throughout the week, whether that's about making big decisions that face the company or a business. I remember when well, not I remember personally, but I read about when Steve Jobs came back to Apple in I think it was like the late 80s. He'd been ousted by the company about 10 years previous to that. Then he went off to set up Pixar, and that became very successful. And then he came back into Apple. And Apple was about to die, basically. They're really not doing very well at all, which is not imaginable these days, but that was the truth back in the days. And he basically killed, I think it was like 12 out of 14 products that were in development for the company. And he said, we're going to pause, we're going to stop, we're going to focus on these two. And I think it was the iMac and the iPod or something like that. And that's what we're going to put all of our collective energy into, and we will then, rebuild in that way. And that was a really brave decision, because anybody else looking at it from the outside would think, well, actually, killing a bunch of your products that have been in development is probably suicide to a certain degree. Why would you do that? But he really understood the power of focusing all your energy and slowing down, and then sort of taking it step by step and going forwards. So sometimes that's sort of the thing that's necessary. And sometimes it's really just calling time out and taking a longer period of time out, right? Whether that's from work, from a relationship, from a client relationship, if they're causing, lots of trouble, whatever it might be. So I think it's just using that pace to our advantage. I think we think the faster we run, the more successful we are, or the faster we'll get through a bad situation. And it takes a lot of confidence to rein that in. So to me, that's one of the biggest discoveries, I think, that, we sort of try and consciously adapt in our everyday lives as well. Take a walk around the block, clear your head. There's a lot of wisdom in that, right? You do become more efficient. You do get a completely different perspective. So I'd say that very practically is something that everyone can probably just be a bit more conscious about in their day-to-day life. What do you think, Gemma?
So many tips in there. I feel like I should have a pen out and get myself, because the thing is, even though I live this stuff, it's my research, it's my practical work, I still have to remind myself of these things. And I think such great advice, not being afraid to change direction or change your decision. And there is 100% confidence in that, for sure. And also it comes back to that perspective part of resilience as well. I think my advice could, think about where we are right now in terms of, we've just lived through and worked through a pandemic, and we're in this new normal apparently, but we don't know what the new normal is yet. The world is still changing. It's not like we've stepped off this boat that's been out at sea and we're back on firm ground. We don't necessarily know what the new normal is going to look like, but ultimately the thing I think is really important is we don't know what the new normal is for us yet, what we want, what's going to make us happy, what's how we want to live our lives, how we want to move forward. I feel like we're stepping into a bit of a hangover, in that when the pandemic started, it was so scary. I think all of us at one point or another had a thought of, I don't know where this is going to end, I don't know where this is going to go. And obviously we've moved a long way from that, hopefully, but we can't forget collectively we went through that. Then there was lots of change. There was so much uncertainty that it was so hard to make a call about what was going to be happening in the following month, let alone, 2 years down the line. So I think the initial reaction kind of globally and collectively is that we did get through it. We got our heads down. That's one period of time where we probably were showing kind of mental toughness and grit. I'm not saying it wasn't scary, and we had lots of emotions around that as well, but collectively we were trying to get through it. We were trying to do the right thing. We were trying to come out the other end, and now we're out there at the other end. Well, in the UK, I know not everywhere, we kind of feel like potentially we're out the other end. We don't know necessarily, but I think there's a lot still to deal with that we haven't necessarily processed because we've been going through the situation. So I think it's now time to start processing some of that. So what it means for us, some of those emotions perhaps that were there, some of those decisions we had to make, or some of the things that are kind of still with us, but perhaps we don't really know how to deal with that because we're getting on with normal life. So I guess my tip when it comes to building resilience is actually kind of dealing with that hangover and thinking about, okay, take it slowly, take it week by week. What's gone well? What hasn't gone so well? What am I going to change? And just kind of keep moving forward slowly and give yourself small things to work towards. It could be building relationships. It could be taking some time out. It could be boosting your energy. It could be finding activities which absorb you, so you're in that kind of flow state. I talk about lots and lots of kind of different types of strategies in the book, but this really is your time now, all of our time, to think about how are we consciously going to move forward, like not just rolling with it. There could be some decisions that we need to make. So how are we consciously going to do that in a way that slowly over time we can start to build, working lives and home lives that we want to build. But again, there's no rush.
I've got an 8-year-old daughter, and she's got a little bit of anxiety at the moment, I think, as well, because of all this hangover. And we've been speaking to parents at school and teachers, and a lot of kids are going through that at the moment. And if kids are going through that, I imagine adults who are at the coalface of lockdown and everything that's happened are, either consciously or subconsciously, equally, if not more affected by it. So, and it's interesting because I thought that was gone now. The kids have digested it. We're moving on. But no, now it's all bubbling up. Right now, when the dust is settling, all these emotions are coming to the forefront. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's probably a coping mechanism. We had to get through it. We had to cope in one way or another. All of us did. We dug deep, so many of us. But actually, we've still got some processing to do, I think.
Thank you both for answering my questions and for all those tips. There were so many tips, definitely needed a paper and pen, but it's fine. The event is recorded, so everyone can go back and have a look. But it was really good to see some sort of bigger thinking, but also bringing it back to those kind of actions that you can take on a smaller scale day to day, just to help you get to maybe a place where you can then think more long term and start reframing habits and sort of thoughts. So I think that's really helpful. So thank you both for that. We have so many questions in the chat and we have 15 minutes to go. So I'm going to ask that we try and maybe get through as many as we possibly can. So I'm going to start with the first question from Kathy. She's asking, do you think the PERMA model, so positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meanings and accomplishment, which I think is in relation to well-being and how you can sort of cultivate better well-being, is a good model for corporate leaders to use as a framework to build resilience? I'm going to go to Gemma first for this one.
Super simple. Yes, I do. It's a model that I have used before, and I think it's something, there's so many like elements in there that are useful. I use the resilience edge model, which comes from my research, but which is kind of built out from the PERMA model, but 100%, I think it's a brilliant place to start. And I think that comes back to Seligman, I think, and positive psychology.
Anna, do you have anything to add?
I haven't actually, because I haven't used it, but I think Gemma makes an excellent point, and I will try it.
Yeah, maybe you can update us all on it afterwards. How it goes.
I will do.
Great. Well, then we'll move on to our question from Dale, and the question is, how do you see the role of realistic expectations? So being realistic about the challenges you face and whatever the situation. I'm going to start with Anna for this one.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Sarah actually wrote a chapter on that, which is sort of balancing optimism with realism, and how it's really important not to sort of just be gung-ho optimistic about stuff and, think everything's going to be okay, because to a certain degree, you're kind of setting yourself up for disappointment or, unnecessary challenge. Equally, you don't want to be the pessimist who, thinks everything is going to, go wrong and nothing's going to ever come of the situation that you're in. So I think it's just sort of finding that right balance between the two, and sort of leaning into what brings you energy, right? If it is more from the positive side, think of the things that you can do that can really help you to overcome what you're experiencing, lean on people around you. Communities are really, important aspect of this, having those shared experiences. Or some people get more energy actually from the realistic part of that equation, where that just really gives them the sense of urgency to change things, right? And we saw people lead into each which direction that we interviewed. Some people definitely were more positively inclined. Some people definitely needed that reality check of, oh my God, if I don't do something now, this is really gonna continue to go downhill. So I think it just depends a little bit about the type of person you are. I personally lean a bit more towards the, oh my God, if I don't do something now, something bad's going to happen. And I that's where I get my energy, right? So I think it's just a very personal choice.
Thank you. And Gemma, do you have anything to add on this?
Yes, I also talk about realistic optimism. So I thought that's part of like how I frame, because we talk a lot about optimism in resilience, but equally, I kind of explain it as you want to have your head, your vision, where you're going in the clouds, but you want one foot on the ground in reality as well, because otherwise it can become really toxic. That is toxic positivity. And I think the same thing applies to expectations for ourselves as well. Yes, you want to have one foot on the ground, like what's actually possible, but equally you want to be pushing yourself past what has been done before as well. You want to have that kind of head in the clouds vision, where am I going? And I think it applies to that. But I do think sometimes the research has shown this as well, that sometimes we think we can do things much quicker than we can. So there's the whole thing, if you imagine what you can do in a year, we often think we can do way more than we can, but then actually we underestimate what we can do over 5 years. And I think that comes back to expectations.
So I want to just jump ahead to a question in the chat that's recently come in, just because it is related to this. So it's from Stevo, and what would you recommend where maybe your reality or your realistic expectations are based on past experience, where you've had multiple failures, and then there's an element of fear that comes in as well, because you're then fearful that you're going to fail again and overcoming these. So how can you then motivate yourself around that and achieve a bit more of that balance that you were speaking about? Gemma, maybe if you carry on where you were.
So I know that fear is scary. I know that failing can be really scary. I think that some of the things that I failed at in life that have been really challenging, and it raised a lot of emotions as well. So it's something we've sometimes got to be a bit careful about. I know there's this whole concept to kind of feel the fear and do it anyway. And sometimes I think that's really useful, that, we have to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone. But equally, we also have to remember that, you know, we're humans with thinking processes, we have emotions and we react. So it's managing some of that as well. I think that using is kind of pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, sometimes in a safe way. So taking a little step. So it's that kind of so it's pressure that you're feeding, but it's not overwhelming. And only you as an individual know where that is and where to pull back. Sometimes it can help to work with someone like a coach, for example, to help to do that. Or it could be things like, you know, both of our books are so practical. It's testing some of the strategies in there or taking some of that on board and challenging yourself a little bit. But my advice is to challenge yourself slowly and also start to work on reframing some of those past failures so that they're not just failures, they were learning experiences. There were things that you took from that. You'll never be in the same position again because there would have been things that you learned from that situation. So starting to kind of maybe process some of that as well might be helpful.
Anna, I wanted to come to you second on this because I know this is your entire wheelhouse of kind of rebuilding from failure. So
yeah, I mean, again, I think, you know, Gemma gave a really excellent perspective there, and you know, it's a little bit how long is a piece of string, right? So you can count it so many different ways. I think what's really interesting is that you can fail multiple times for very different reasons, right? At the same thing, it might be that on one occasion it's down to something actually that you did that you were in control of. It might be on another occasion had absolutely nothing to do with you, and it was influenced by outside factors, either people or environmental or whatever. So I think it's always really important to have a think about why something hasn't worked out, right? And then really just focus and try not get sidetracked, but really just focus on the things that you can impact and that you can control in order to try and make headway and sort of overcome that. So, and that's really, really difficult because obviously the temptation is to try and control everything or be in control of everything. And if you're not in control of everything, that, you know, creates a whole separate freak out. You know, why am I not in control of everything? But really sort of just taking it step at a time, you know, one by one, not getting fazed by uncertainty and actually being okay by the uncertainty that will inevitably live around a rebuild because you don't know what's, you know, 2 days down the line, 2 weeks down the line, whatever it might be. And just sort of being flexible. I think that's something that we talked about earlier, being flexible in your approach and being able to pivot, right? And if you're trying something and it's not working, don't get disheartened, try something else. You know, that's just a process of trying to figure out your path through that sort of maze of rebuilding. So I say step by step, don't try and control everything, be flexible if things aren't working. And just try to, I guess, keep an open mind and see the failure as a good thing in a way, because it means that you've learned something. And even if you can't get yourself out of a particular twist on one occasion, the skill sets that you're deploying and that you're learning, you can use for the next time something doesn't work out, right? So it's building that muscle memory. It's building practice like you would do any kind of muscle or memory function to deploy for the next time. And there will be a next time. So that's one thing we can all be sure of.
Yeah, in an era of uncertainty, we can be certain of that at least. And moving on to our next question from Claire, what would you say is your biggest tip for HR or people departments when they're trying to promote resilience and mental agility in the workplace? So Anna, could you start with this one, please?
Yeah, I mean, there's I saw that question in the chat, and there's one thing that popped into my mind immediately. It's sort of quite a small thing, but I think it's actually quite significant, and that is make sure that everyone takes their annual holiday. Because I think there's a statistic out there that I think what the average person forgoes six days of their annual leave or something like that. I should know it because it's in the book, but I think it's something like that. And that's because people think they're too busy to take a holiday, ironically. But coming back to what we're talking about pausing, about pacing yourself, about taking time out, about gaining that perspective, all that comes from time away from the daily grind, right? And I think if you can encourage everyone, starting from the very top, make sure that the leaders of an organization are absolutely visible in making sure that they take their holiday and letting people know that they don't want to be disturbed, and sort of really encouraging the people underneath them to do the same. I think that could at least start to give people the headspace and the energy to start working on their resilience skills. So I'm sure there are many other things that could be done, but that's just one thing that immediately jumped to mind that isn't that difficult to implement.
I love that. And I think that was a real issue that was highlighted during the pandemic, where I think everyone was just so hopeful that we'd be coming out of lockdown so they could take their holiday to do things. And you just kind of keep building and getting more and more stressed.
And we see that as well in our organization, right? Sort of the last sort of 6 weeks before Christmas, everyone's frantically trying to burn their holiday. And you just sort of think that's not why these things were invented, so that you just sort of mindlessly blow them on shopping days because you have to somehow, fill that time. Take them in the summer, take the odd long weekend every now and again, really be mindful and conscious of how you do that.
Yeah.
They're there for a reason. And we are more productive as a result. There's a lot of research to back that up.
It's very true. Gemma, have you got any other tips?
So my research was looking at factors like HR policies or leadership, how leaders manage their teams and support and their style, and how all of that stuff impacts resilience for individuals. And the truth of it is that things like policies, procedures, that kind of stuff, so some of the stuff that comes from HR make a huge difference. So if people know where to access information, if they know that they're supported, that makes a huge difference. But equally, there's a huge part as well around leaders role modeling this, so telling stories about their own resilience, their challenges, their how they've responded to events, what's gone well, sometimes where their resilience might be low, sometimes where it might be higher, can make a huge difference. Also making sure that leaders and managers across the board are trained in this, so they know, they have a common language about resilience, because it can be a scary topic. I'm a psychologist, and it can still be complicated. So, but it doesn't have to be. There are simple ways that people can talk about this stuff and to share stories as well. So that's part of the work that I do, is putting a common language around this that's really accessible. And also thinking about role modeling as well, so showing people. But again, I don't come back to it all the time, this stories part. If you can set up forums or places where people can share their stories, whether they're leaders, whether they're not, that doesn't necessarily matter. We know that sharing stories can help to inspire people, firstly to share their own stories, sometimes where it can be a bit awkward, or can feel a bit overwhelming, but also it can help people understand or learn about tools that can help to build resilience, potentially before they even need them, because someone else is talking about what they've done, and people can learn from that. Because people, we always say learn from your mistakes and learn from what you've done, but I think, why not learn from other people as well, and collect that information as well. So I think there's definitely kind of policies, procedures, 100% that needs to be looked at, and I hope that's been looked at across most organizations, but it is this kind of role modeling, stories, leaders part as well.
Thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for our questions, and I can see that there's still a few more in the chat. I'm really sorry we're not going to get to them today, but we have put a reminder of the authors' social media posts and tags, so please do connect with them. I'm sure I'm offering up their services. I'm sure they won't mind. Do contact them if you've got any other questions, but also do take a look at their books, because they do cover a lot of this in there as well.